The sand has worked its way into every wound. Nefertari is 24 years old, and she can feel the grains grinding against the raw places where the ropes have stripped her wrists, can taste blood and dust on her cracked lips, can smell her own fear mixing with the animal stink of the donkeys that have dragged her cart for 11 days across the desert. She was, until 16 days ago, the wife of Amenhotep, chief scribe of the temple of Amun at Thebes, a woman who wore linen so fine it was nearly transparent, who ate from plates of faience, who had servants to oil her skin and braid her hair with beads of gold. Now she kneels in a wooden cage on wheels, her shaved head burning under the sun of Upper Egypt, her body covered in a shift so rough it raises welts wherever it touches skin. The shift is deliberate. She was told that when she arrived at her destination. Too fine would suggest she retained some status. Too poor would suggest she was not worth the journey. This roughness, this specific grade of discomfort, marked her as what the court had declared her to be. Given. The word had been spoken by the magistrate without emphasis, without cruelty, without any apparent awareness that he was ending her life while leaving her alive. Her husband Amenhotep had been accused of stealing from the temple treasury. The evidence was fabricated. She knew this. The priests knew this. Everyone knew this, but Amenhotep's rival Userhat had powerful friends. And powerful friends meant that evidence did not need to be real to be effective. Amenhotep was sentenced to the copper mines, where men rarely survived more than 2 years. She was sentenced to something else. Something the legal codes described in language so clinical that she had not understood, at first, what it meant. Given to the soldiers of the garrison at Buhan. She had asked the magistrate to clarify. She had asked him to explain what given meant in practical terms, what her status would be, what rights she would retain. The magistrate had looked at her with something that might have been pity, or might have been contempt, or might have been nothing at all. "You will have no status," he said. "You will retain no rights. You will be communal property of the garrison. Every soldier, from the commander to the lowest conscript, will have equal claim to your person. You will serve the garrison until you are released, or until you die, whichever comes first." Now, 11 days into the journey that will take her to the southern frontier of Egypt, to a fortress on the edge of Nubian territory where 300 soldiers live in isolation from everything they knew, she is beginning to understand what those words actually meant. The cart stops. Men approach soldiers from the escort, their faces wrapped against the blowing sand, their eyes evaluating her through the gaps in the cloth. They have been evaluating her since the journey began, calculating, assessing, discussing in low voices what will happen when they reach Buhan, and she is officially transferred to garrison command. This is not random cruelty, she is beginning to understand. This is system. This is a punishment that Egypt has refined over centuries, a method of destroying a woman without the mess of execution, a way of making someone disappear from respectable society while technically remaining alive. The garrison at Buhan has received women before. The soldiers know what to do with them. The commanders know how to manage them. There are procedures, protocols, a bureaucracy of degradation that makes the process efficient and the outcomes predictable. One of the soldiers unlocks her cage and drags her out into the burning sand. He pushes a water skin toward her mouth, not from kindness but from practicality. She is cargo. Damaged cargo is less valuable than intact cargo. He is maintaining the merchandise. 3 more days, he says. Then you belong to Buhan. Belong. Another word that carries weight she is only beginning to understand. She drinks the water and memorizes the soldier's face. She memorizes the positions of the guards, the arrangement of the supplies, the direction of the sun, the distance they have traveled. She does not know yet what she will do with this information. But information is the only thing they cannot take from her. and she intends to gather as much of it as possible before she arrives at the place where she will cease to be a person and become something else entirely. What you are about to learn has been systematically excluded from the popular narratives that celebrate ancient Egypt as a civilization of pyramids and pharaohs, of golden treasures and mystical wisdom. The scholars who marvel at Egyptian art and architecture have chosen not to examine too closely what that civilization did to those who fell outside its protections. The documentaries that celebrate Cleopatra and Nefertiti prefer not to mention the women whose names were erased, whose bodies were given away, whose destruction was so complete that they left almost no trace in the historical record. Tonight you will learn about the punishment the Egyptians called giving to the soldiers. Not execution, which would have been quick, not slavery, which at least provided clear legal status, but something worse than either. A dissolution of personhood so complete that the woman who endured it ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, while her body continued to function, continued to be used, continued to serve purposes that the legal codes described only in euphemisms. You will learn why this punishment was reserved for specific crimes, particularly crimes that embarrassed powerful men or threatened the stability of religious institutions. You will learn about the frontier garrisons where these women were sent, isolated outposts where 300 soldiers lived for years without leave, without families, without access to the women of respectable society. You will learn what happened in those garrisons, not in graphic detail, but in the systematic reality that the sources preserve. You will learn about the women who survived, because some did survive, emerging after years of garrison service into a world that did not know what they had endured, that had no framework for understanding what had been done to them. You will learn what happened to these survivors, how they rebuilt lives from fragments, how some chose silence and some chose testimony, how the stories that survived were almost always filtered through male scribes who had their own reasons for recording or concealing. You will learn why Egyptian sources describe this punishment so rarely, why the legal codes that authorize it use language so vague that scholars have debated for decades what it actually meant. You will learn that the vagueness was deliberate, that the punishment was designed to be unspeakable in the literal sense, something that respectable Egyptians did not speak about directly, because speaking about it would acknowledge realities they preferred to ignore. Subscribe if you want to understand the darkness beneath Egypt's golden surface. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Because Nefertari is 3 days away from Buhan, 3 days away from becoming communal property of 300 soldiers, 3 days away from discovering what given actually means. And I am going to tell you exactly what she experienced. But before I reveal what happened to Nefertari in that garrison, before I explain the system that processed her and the years that changed her, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Egyptian justice functioned, why this punishment existed, and what made it worse than the alternatives that seem more obviously terrible. Because you cannot understand what Nefertari endured without understanding the logic that created her fate. Egyptian justice was not designed to be fair. It was designed to maintain order, protect the powerful, and make examples of those who threatened the stability that allowed civilization to function along the narrow strip of fertile land bordering the Nile. The legal system had developed over nearly 2,000 years by the time Nefertari's sentence was pronounced. It was sophisticated, bureaucratic, documented in records that allow modern scholars to reconstruct its operations in considerable detail. Egyptians believed in Ma'at, the cosmic principle of order and justice, and they believed that their legal system embodied this principle, that the punishments they imposed were not merely practical but cosmically appropriate. This belief allowed them to impose punishments of extraordinary cruelty while maintaining absolute certainty that they were acting righteously. The punishment system was graduated according to the severity of the offense and the status of the offender. Minor crimes might result in beatings, fines, or forced labor. More serious crimes could lead to mutilation, the cutting off of ears, nose, or hands, or to the copper mines, where conditions were so brutal that sentences of more than 2 years were effectively death sentences. The most serious crimes against the state or the gods warranted execution, sometimes by impalement, sometimes by being thrown to the crocodiles, sometimes by being burned alive. But there were also crimes that occupied a peculiar middle ground, crimes that were serious enough to require severe punishment, but that involved circumstances making standard punishments inappropriate. Crimes where the guilty party was a man of some status, but his wife was also implicated, even if only by association. Crimes where making an example required punishment that would be visible and memorable, without requiring the expense and ritual pollution of execution. For these crimes, the punishment of giving was available. The practice appears to have originated in the military context. Frontier garrisons, isolated for years at a time, posed specific problems for military discipline. Soldiers who served at places like Buin or Elephantine were far from their families, far from the women of their communities, far from any acceptable outlet for desires that Egyptian culture normally channeled through marriage and concubinage. Left entirely without sexual access, these soldiers became restless, violent, prone to the kind of disorder that threatened military effectiveness. The solution that emerged was pragmatic in the way that military solutions often are. Certain women, criminals, prisoners of war, sometimes slaves who had offended their owners were assigned to garrison use. They belonged to no individual soldier. They were communal property, available to any man who wanted them, maintained by the garrison command as a collective resource. This system served multiple purposes. It provided an outlet for soldiers' desires, reducing the tensions that might otherwise explode into violence against each other or against the local population. It created a punishment for women that was worse than death, while avoiding the religious complications of execution. It made examples of women whose crimes or whose husbands' crimes required visible consequences without requiring visible bodies. The women who were given to garrisons occupied a legal status unlike anything else in Egyptian society. They were not slaves, because slaves had owners who bore responsibility for them. They were not prisoners, because prisoners were held for specific terms and then released. They were not even property in the normal sense, because property could be bought, sold, inherited, and protected. They were, in the legal terminology that survives, simply given. The word suggests transfer, suggests that something has changed hands, but it does not specify to whom or for what purpose. The vagueness was intentional. Everyone knew what given meant. No one wanted to specify it directly. Now let us return to Nefertari, who has arrived at the fortress of Buhen after 14 days of travel through the desert. The fortress is larger than she expected. Stone walls rise 40 feet from the sand, crenellated and watchtowered, designed to withstand siege by Nubian armies that have tested Egyptian power for generations. Inside the walls, she can see barracks, storehouses, a small temple. The administrative buildings where Garrison Command manages the complex logistics of keeping 300 men alive and functional on the edge of hostile territory. The escort hands her over to a garrison officer who examines documents, makes notes on a tablet, and gestures for her to be taken to a building near the western wall. She memorizes the path, the positions of the guards, the layout of the fortress as she is led through streets that fall silent when she passes. The soldiers know what she is. They have seen women like her before. The building near the western wall is small, perhaps 20 feet by 30, divided into a main room and a smaller chamber at the back. The main room contains bedding of a sort rough mats arranged along the walls, blankets that have seen better decades, a few wooden stools. The smaller chamber contains a latrine pit and a basin for washing. The walls are mud brick, the floor packed earth. the ceiling low enough that a tall man would have to duck. A woman emerges from the shadows of the main room. She is perhaps 35, her face weathered, her body bearing marks that Nefertari recognizes from the injuries she herself sustained during transport. But her eyes are what hold Nefertari's attention. They are flat, empty, the eyes of someone who has seen everything and retreated to a place where nothing can reach her. "I am Henutmehit," the woman says. "I have been here for 6 years. I will explain how things work. How many of us are there?" 3, now that you have arrived. There were 4 until last month. Sitmut died. Fever, the commander said. It was not fever. Nefertari absorbs this information. 3 women for 300 soldiers. The mathematics of what this implies is staggering. "How do we survive?" she asks. Henutmehit's expression does not change. "Most of us do not. The average is 2 years. I have survived 6 because I learned things that the others did not learn. I will teach you, if you are capable of learning. What things? Which soldiers are dangerous, and which are merely brutal? Which officers have enough authority to provide protection in exchange for exclusivity? How to maintain your health when everything in this place is designed to destroy it? How to remain yourself inside when everything outside is trying to erase you?" She gestures toward one of the mats. "Rest now. Tonight, the commander will summon you. He claims first access to all new arrivals. After that, you will be made available to the garrison. The first week is the worst. If you survive the first week, you have a chance of surviving longer." Nefertari sits on the mat she has been assigned. The rough fabric scratches against her legs, already raw from the journey. She can hear sounds from outside soldiers calling to each other, the clatter of equipment, the ordinary noises of military life that will be the backdrop to her existence for however long she lasts. "What happened to you?" she asks Henutmehit. "What was your crime?" "My husband was a priest who objected to the wrong policy. He was sent to the mines. I was sent here." She pauses. "He died in the first year. I learned about it from a supply officer who thought the information might make me more cooperative." "Did it?" "No. Nothing makes us more cooperative. Nothing makes any of this acceptable. But we learn to endure because the alternative is to die, and dying is easy here. Living is hard. I have chosen hard." She retreats to her own mat, leaving Nefertari alone with questions she does not yet know how to ask. The commander's name was Waset, and he was not what Nefertari expected. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the bearing of a career soldier and the tired eyes of a man who had spent too many years in places he did not want to be. His quarters were austere by the standards of Egyptian officers, functional furniture, no decorations beyond a small shrine to Amun. None of the luxuries that men of his rank typically accumulated. He sat behind a table covered with documents and watched her approach with an expression she could not read. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a stool across the table from him. She sat. The stool was low enough that she had to look up at him, a deliberate arrangement that reinforced the power differential between them. But his tone was not harsh, and his eyes, when they met hers, held something other than the predatory calculation she had seen in other men since her sentencing. "You are Nefertari, wife of Amenhotep, formerly chief scribe of the Temple of Amun." "I am." "Your husband was convicted of theft from the temple treasury. The evidence suggests he was framed by a rival named Userhat, who had connections to the high priest's faction. Your husband was sent to the copper mines. You were sent here." She had not expected him to know the details of her case. She had not expected him to mention that Amenhotep was framed, to acknowledge what everyone knew, but no one admitted. "You seem well informed," she said. "I make it my business to know who is sent to my garrison and why. It helps me understand what I am dealing with." He leaned back in his chair. "I also make it my business to understand the political currents in Thebes. Userhat is a dangerous man. He destroyed your husband to eliminate a rival, and he destroyed you to ensure that no one with knowledge of your husband's innocence would remain in a position to cause trouble. If you know he was innocent, why does that change nothing? Because justice and truth are different things. Justice is what the courts declare. Truth is what actually happened. Egypt runs on justice, not truth. I have learned this over 30 years of service. He rose from the table and moved to a cabinet where he poured wine into 2 cups. He handed one to her, a gesture so unexpected that she almost dropped it. You are now communal property of this garrison, he said. The legal codes are clear about what that means. You have no status, no rights, no protections beyond what I choose to provide. Every soldier in this fortress, from my officers to the lowest conscript, has equal claim to your person. I understand. I do not think you do. Not yet. He sat back down, his wine untouched. There are 300 soldiers in this garrison. Most of them have been here for years with no leave, no families, no access to women outside of those assigned to communal use. They are not evil men, most of them. But they are men under conditions that erode the restraints that civilization normally imposes. What happens to you here will not be the result of particular cruelty. It will be the result of system, of numbers, of what 300 men without other outlets will do when a woman is made available to them. Then why tell me this? Why give me wine and explain my situation as if I were a person rather than cargo? Kayamwaset was silent for a long moment before answering. Because I am tired, he said finally. Tired of this posting, tired of this system, tired of pretending that what happens here is justice rather than organized brutality. I have commanded this garrison for 12 years. I have watched 11 women arrive in your position. 3 survived to be released. 8 died. I could not save any of them. Perhaps I cannot save you either. But I can at least acknowledge that you are a person being fed into a machine, rather than pretending that the machine is righteous. What happened to the 3 who survived? They were released when the terms of their sentences ended, or when political circumstances changed enough that their continued punishment became inconvenient. They returned to Egypt. I do not know what became of them afterward. How long is my sentence? Your sentence has no term. You are given to this garrison until you are released, or until you die. Release requires a petition to the authorities in Thebes, which requires someone with influence to file it. Since Userhat has influence, and you have none, I would not expect release unless circumstances change significantly. Nefertari absorbed this information. No fixed term, no expectation of release, only endurance until death, or until something changed that she could not predict or control. You said you cannot save me, she said. But you also said some women survived. What made them different? Kayamwaset looked at her with something that might have been approval. They found purposes, he said. Reasons to continue that went beyond mere biological persistence. They built strategies for managing what happened to them. They created alliances, with me, with other women, sometimes with soldiers who were less brutal than average and could be cultivated as protectors. Will you protect me? I will do what I can within the limits of my position. I am commander of this garrison, but I am also subject to regulations and expectations that I cannot openly violate. I can claim first access to new arrivals, that is expected, a privilege of rank. I can assign you to duties that reduce your availability to the general population for portions of the day. I can punish soldiers who damage garrison property excessively. Property, she repeated. That is what I am. That is what the law declares you to be. What you are inside your own mind is something only you can determine. He rose from the table, the interview apparently concluded. Tonight you will stay here, in my quarters. Tomorrow you will be assigned to the women's building and made available to the garrison. Use tonight to rest, to think, to prepare yourself for what is coming. What is coming? I will not describe it. You will learn soon enough. But I will tell you this. The first week is the worst. Survive the first week, and you have a chance. Give up during the first week, and you will not last a month." He turned away, dismissing her to the small chamber attached to his quarters where she would spend what might be her last night as something other than communal property. She lay on the bed he had provided, a real bed, with actual linens, the last comfort she would experience for who knew how long, and tried to prepare for something she could not imagine. The morning brought the reality that Caimoisette had refused to describe. She was taken to the women's building and formally introduced to her role in the garrison. The introduction was performed by the third woman, a younger one named Merritt, who had arrived 2 years earlier and had survived through a combination of luck and the protection of a sergeant who claimed her more often than others. "There are patterns," Merritt explained. "The soldiers come in waves. Dawn, when the night guard is released. Midday, when those not on duty have free time. Evening, after the main meal. Late night, when those who cannot sleep become restless. How many in a day? It varies. Sometimes 10, sometimes 30. On festival days, when wine is distributed, it can be more. The worst is after a Nubian raid, when soldiers return with the aggression of combat still in their blood. Those nights are difficult." Nefertari filed this information away. Patterns meant predictability. Predictability meant the possibility of strategy. Who is the most dangerous? A sergeant named Sennefer. He claims to be the son of a nobleman from Memphis, though no one believes him. He enjoys causing pain. He requests women specifically so he can hurt them. Sitmut, the one who died, was his favorite. What he did to her is why she died. How does he get away with it? He is careful. He knows how much damage he can inflict without crossing the line that would require Caimoisette to act. He knows the regulations, the loopholes, the ways to destroy a woman slowly enough that it can be attributed to accumulated wear rather than specific abuse. And the commander allows this? The commander is constrained by regulations he did not write. Sennefer has patrons in Thebes, relatives who hold minor positions in the administration. Disciplining him requires documentation, process, justification. Caimoisette has done what he can assign Sennefer to duties that keep him busy, limited his access, warned women to avoid triggering his interest. But he cannot eliminate the threat entirely. Nefertari memorized the name. Sennefer. The specific danger within the general horror. What about protection? You mentioned cultivating soldiers who are less brutal. Some soldiers are capable of something resembling attachment. If you can identify one, if you can make yourself valuable to him beyond the physical, he may claim you often enough that others have less access. This is not safety, but it is better than being available to everyone equally. How do I identify such men? You will learn. Some are obvious, they hesitate. They speak to you like a person. They show discomfort with what they are doing. Others hide their humanity beneath masks, and you must watch carefully to see the cracks. The conversation was interrupted by the first soldiers of the day, men coming off night watch who pushed into the building with the expectation of what awaited them. Merritt fell silent. Hinutmahite, who had been listening from across the room, retreated to a corner with the practiced invisibility of long experience. Nefertari faced what was coming with eyes open, mind working, determination to survive solidifying into something hard and cold in her chest. She would learn the patterns. She would identify the dangers. She would find the cracks in masks and exploit whatever advantages presented themselves. She would be what they required her to be on the outside, while remaining herself on the inside. She would survive. Now, I need to tell you something about the Egyptian frontier garrisons that helps explain what Nefertari experienced. The fortresses along Egypt's southern border with Nubia were not merely military installations. They were complete worlds unto themselves, isolated communities where several hundred men lived for years at a time, with minimal contact with the civilization they served. They were posted there because Egypt needed to control the trade routes that brought gold, ivory, ebony, and slaves from the south. They remained there because the cost and complexity of rotation made regular relief impractical. These conditions shaped everything about garrison life. The men who served at Buchen and similar fortresses were not volunteers. They were conscripts, laborers impressed into military service. Minor criminals offered army duty as an alternative to worse punishments. Occasional professional soldiers who had offended someone powerful enough to exile them to the frontier. They had not chosen to be there. They did not want to be there. They were trapped in the same way that Nefertari was trapped, though their cages were larger and their status nominally different. This shared entrapment created a peculiar psychology. The soldiers resented their situation. They could not express this resentment toward the commanders who controlled them or the system that had placed them there. But they could express it toward those beneath them in the hierarchy, the slaves who served the garrison, the Nubian prisoners taken in raids, and the women who had been given for their use. The women became targets for frustrations that had nothing to do with them personally. They became objects on which soldiers could enact anger, humiliation, powerlessness that they could not safely express in any other direction. The violence they experienced was not purely sexual. It was emotional, psychological, a complex release of feelings that garrison conditions had compressed into explosive potential. The commanders understood this dynamic and managed it accordingly. They knew that the women served as pressure valves, that the system's cruelty was functional, that 3 women destroyed over a period of years was an acceptable cost for maintaining order among 300 men who might otherwise become unmanageable. This was the logic that had created Nefertari's situation, not individual sadism, though sadism certainly existed within the system, but institutional calculation, the cold mathematics of control, the recognition that someone had to absorb the pressures that garrison life generated, and that women with no status, no rights, no legal existence were the most efficient choice. The system was designed, the system was maintained, the system consumed women like Nefertari at a predictable rate and treated this consumption as a necessary operating cost. This is what she had been fed into. This is what she had to survive. The first week was exactly as terrible as Kaimwaset had warned. Nefertari experienced what she would later describe when she eventually told her story as a dissolution. The boundary between herself and what was being done to her seemed to blur, to soften, to threaten to disappear entirely. She felt herself retreating into a small space deep inside, a refuge where she could wait out the assaults like waiting out a sandstorm, knowing it would pass, knowing that if she stayed small enough and still enough, she might survive it. She learned to count the men who used her in the first week. 37, by her count, though some returned multiple times, and she might have miscounted. The time became hazy, individual incidents blurring together into a continuous experience of use that had no clear boundaries. But she counted because counting maintained a kind of structure, a framework of numbers that replaced the framework of selfhood that she felt slipping away. She learned to observe who was rough and who was merely indifferent, who spoke during the encounters and who remained silent, who looked at her face and who avoided her eyes entirely. These observations became data, and data became the foundation for strategy. She learned to identify Senefer, the sergeant that Merritt had warned her about. He was a large man, heavyset, with a face that might have been handsome before cruelty had carved its permanent expression into his features. He came to the women's building on her 3rd day, and something in the way his eyes moved over her told her that she had attracted his interest, that she would need to be very careful. He did not select her that day. He selected Henutmehit instead, and what Nefertari heard from the smaller chamber, not screaming, because Henutmehit had learned that screaming provoked him, but sounds of impact and muffled pain confirmed everything Merritt had told her. When Senefer left, Nefertari went to Henutmehit and helped her clean the blood from cuts that had been carefully placed where they would not show. Hanutmahite accepted the help without comment, her eyes flat, her face showing nothing. He was testing, Hanutmahite said finally, testing whether you would intervene, testing whether you would provide him with an excuse to add you to his interests. I almost did intervene. I know. I saw you move. That is why I did not cry out. If you had come into the room, he would have had both of us, and neither of us would have survived what followed. How do you know? Because that is what happened to Sitmut. She tried to help a new arrival. Sennefer used it as justification. She lasted another month after that, but she was already dying. Nefertari absorbed the lesson. Intervention was dangerous. Solidarity could be exploited. Survival required calculation, not impulse. Then how do we help each other? Quietly, indirectly. Information, protection during recovery, teaching what we have learned. Never openly, never in ways that Sennefer can use against us. This became the first of many lessons in the particular survival strategies that the women's building required. 2 months after Nefertari's arrival, she identified the first crack she had been looking for. His name was Baki, and he was a junior scribe attached to the garrison's administrative section. He was perhaps 25, young for his position, sent to Buhen as punishment for some minor error that had annoyed his superiors in Thebes. Unlike the career soldiers who comprised most of the garrison, he had education, perspective, the remnants of civilized sensibility that desert service had not yet entirely erased. He came to the women's building with the awkwardness of someone who did not want to be there, but could not find a way to explain this to his peers. He hesitated at the door. He apologized, actually apologized, before taking what the system entitled him to take. He did not hurt her beyond what the act itself required. And when it was over, he did not leave immediately. He sat on the edge of the mat and asked her name. Nefertari, she said, wife of Amenhotep, formerly chief scribe of the Temple of Amun. Baki's expression shifted. Amenhotep. I knew his work. He was respected in the scribal community. His commentaries on the Book of the Dead were considered authoritative. You are a scribe? I was. I am. This posting is temporary, or at least I tell myself it is temporary. When I complete my term, I will return to Thebes and resume my career. He paused. I did not know that Amenhotep's wife was here. I did not know what happened to her. Now you know. Now I know. And I am. He trailed off, unable to find words adequate to the situation. I am sorry. That means nothing, I understand. But I am sorry. It means something, Nefertari said. It means you see me as a person. Most of them do not. This was the beginning. Over the following weeks, Baki returned to the women's building with increasing frequency, always selecting Nefertari, claiming enough of her time that other soldiers' access was somewhat reduced. He brought her things extra food from the officers' mess, a blanket that was less rough than the standard issue, eventually books, papyrus scrolls that he smuggled from the garrison's small library. She read them in secret, in the hours between demands, hiding them beneath her mat when soldiers approached. She discussed them with Baki during his visits, conversations that must have seemed bizarre literary analysis, conducted in the aftermath of encounters that neither of them wanted, but that the system required. She was not using him. Or rather, she was using him, but she was also genuinely grateful, genuinely connected to him, in the way that desperate people connect to those who see them as human. He was her access to the world she had lost, the civilization of letters and ideas and conversations that had meaning beyond survival, and he was her protection. Not complete protection, she was still available to others, still subject to the attentions of men who saw her only as function but partial protection, enough to give her breathing room, enough to allow her to maintain the internal structure that kept herself from dissolving entirely. Hinotmahite noticed. You have found a patron, she said one evening, when they were alone in the building. That is good. It may help you survive. Is that what you did? Found a patron? I tried. 3 times. The first was killed in a Nubian raid. The second was rotated to a different posting. The third. She was silent for a moment. The third became something other than a patron. Something that required me to accept things I did not want to accept in exchange for protection I could not afford to lose. What happened to him? He is still here. He still claims me regularly. I have learned to provide what he needs, and he has learned to protect me from the worst of what the garrison offers. Her voice was flat, her eyes empty. It is not life, but it is survival. Nefertari understood that she was being told something important. That survival in this place required transactions that went beyond the obvious, that the alliances formed in the women's building had depths and complications that simple descriptions could not capture. She also understood that she would do whatever was necessary. She had made that decision in the first week, when the dissolution had threatened to consume her, when the option of surrendering had presented itself with seductive clarity. She had chosen survival. She would continue choosing survival, whatever that required. 6 months after her arrival, the pattern that had begun to form was disrupted. A new woman arrived at Buhin. Her name was Iset Nofret, and she was 17 years old. Her crime was being the daughter of a provincial administrator who had supported the wrong faction in a political dispute. Her father had been executed. Her mother had been given to a different garrison. She had been given to Buhin. She arrived in worse condition than Nefertari had. The escort that brought her had not been as careful with the merchandise, and she bore bruises and cuts that would take weeks to heal. She also arrived with a terror so complete that she could barely speak, barely move, barely process what was happening to her. Nefertari looked at this girl and saw something she recognized. Saw the dissolution beginning, the retreat into a small internal space, the surrender that would lead to destruction within weeks if it was not interrupted. She remembered what Hinutmehit had said about Sitmut, about the danger of open intervention, about how Sennefer had used solidarity as a weapon. But she also remembered what she had decided, that survival required purpose, that endurance without meaning became merely prolonged death. This girl could be her purpose. I will teach you, she told Iset Nofret that night, when the first wave of soldiers had finished and the building was temporarily quiet. I will show you what I have learned, how to manage this place, how to survive it, how to remain yourself inside when everything outside is trying to erase you. Why? Iset Nofret's voice was barely audible. Why would you help me? Because I need a reason to continue, because helping you gives me that reason, because I am not willing to become what they want me to become, and teaching you how to resist is part of my resistance. It was the most honest answer she could give. It was also strategically sound. A protégé, someone to train and protect, would provide structure to her existence, would give her something to care about beyond mere biological persistence. Iset Nofret accepted the help. She had no other options. The years that followed were both better and worse than the first 6 months. Better because the patterns had been established, the protections had been secured, the strategies had proven effective. Nefertari knew the garrison now, knew which soldiers to cultivate and which to avoid, knew the rhythms of demand that allowed her to predict when relief might be possible. Baki's patronage had solidified into something stable, and Kaimwaset continued to provide what protection his position allowed. Worse, because the duration stretched on without visible end. The grind of daily existence, the constant demand, the accumulated weight of what she was enduring, these pressed on her in ways that the initial crisis had not. She found herself sometimes struggling to remember who she had been before Buhin, struggling to recall the feel of fine linen or the taste of food that had not been cooked in garrison kitchens. But Iset Nofret gave her purpose. Teaching the younger woman became her project, her mission, the thing that structured her days and gave meaning to her survival. She passed on everything Hanut-Mahite had taught her, everything she had learned herself, the accumulated wisdom of endurance that the women's building had developed over years of receiving and consuming women like her. Isset-Nofret was a good student. She was intelligent, observant, capable of the emotional control that survival required. She learned to identify threats, to manage encounters, to maintain the internal separation between what was done to her body and who she was inside. She developed her own strategies, her own protections, eventually her own tentative relationship with a junior officer who provided what patronage he could. The 3rd year passed. Then the 4th. Hanut-Mahit, who had survived 6 years when Nefertari arrived, died in the 7th, not from violence, but from a fever that her exhausted body could not fight. They buried her according to what rites were possible, 3 women performing rituals that the priests of Egypt would not have recognized, honoring someone whose existence the official records did not acknowledge. Merit, the other survivor, was released at the end of her 5th year. Political circumstances had changed in Thebes. The faction that had condemned her husband had fallen from power, and someone had cared enough to file the petition that freed her. She left Buhen with nothing but the rough clothing she had been given, and a future that none of them could imagine. New women arrived to replace those who had died or been released. Nefertari found herself in Hanut-Mahit's former role, the senior survivor, the one who explained the patterns and taught the strategies and watched new arrivals try to learn what could not really be taught. Senefer remained a constant threat. He had claimed Nefertari twice over the years, and what he had done to her on those occasions had required weeks of recovery. She had learned to make herself as invisible as possible when he was present, to avoid any behavior that might trigger his interest, to provide nothing that he could interpret as provocation. It was not always enough, but it was the best strategy available. Baki was promoted and transferred in the 4th year. Nefertari had known the transfer was coming. He had been honest about his career trajectory, about the temporary nature of his posting, about the life he intended to resume in Thebes. When he left, he promised to petition for her release, to do what he could from Thebes to end her imprisonment. She did not expect him to follow through. She had learned by then that promises made in Buhen rarely survived the journey back to civilization, that men who had seen her as human in this place would find it easier to forget her once they returned to lives where remembering would be inconvenient. But she did not tell him this. She thanked him for his patronage, wished him well in his career, and watched him ride out of the fortress that had been her world for 4 years. She was alone again, or nearly alone. Isset-Nofret remained, the relationship they had built as close to friendship as the garrison allowed. Together they survived the 5th year, then the 6th, then the beginning of the 7th. And then everything changed. The news arrived with a supply convoy in the spring of her 7th year. A treaty had been signed with Nubia. The southern frontier was being reorganized. Several garrisons, including Buhen, were being reduced in size or decommissioned entirely. Soldiers would be rotated back to Egypt. The fortress would be maintained by a skeleton crew rather than a full garrison, and the women who had been given to the disbanded garrisons would be released. Nefertari heard this news from Kayem-Waset, who summoned her to his quarters for the first time in years. He had aged visibly since her arrival, grayer, more stooped, the weariness that had marked him from the beginning now carved deep into his features. "You are to be released," he said. "You and Isset-Nofret both. The order comes from Thebes, from a scribe named Baki, who apparently has more influence than I realized." Baki. He had kept his promise. Against all expectation, against the pattern of every other promise that had been made to her in this place, he had kept his promise. "When?" she asked. "Within the month. You will travel with the soldiers being rotated back to Egypt. You will be given documents establishing your status as free women, no longer subject to the original sentence. What you do after that is your concern. What happens to me when I return? What is my status? Can I work? Can I own property? You are a free woman. Whatever rights free women have, you have. Your sentence has been commuted, your status restored. Whether society will accept you as a free woman is a different question than whether you legally are one. He did not need to explain further. She understood. The stigma of what she had been would follow her. People would know, or would guess, or would sense something in the way she carried herself that marked her as someone who had been where she had been. Legal freedom was one thing. Social acceptance was another. "I want to thank you," she said, "for what protection you provided, for seeing me as human when the system required you to see me as property. I did not do enough. I could not do enough. The system is larger than any one commander, and I was constrained by it, even when I tried to work within it." He looked at her with eyes that held 7 years of accumulated regret. "But I am glad you survived. I am glad you will leave this place alive. Will you leave too? I am being transferred to a posting in Lower Egypt, closer to Thebes, closer to the civilization I have been away from for so long. Perhaps I will find ways to make amends for what I participated in here. Or perhaps I will simply grow old and die like any other soldier. I do not know." She left his quarters for the last time and returned to the women's building to tell Nofret the news. The journey back to Egypt took 3 weeks, traveling with a convoy of soldiers who were returning to posts they had left years before. Nefertari and Nofret rode in a wagon that was little different from the one that had brought Nefertari to Buhen 7 years earlier, but the circumstances had changed entirely. They were not cargo anymore. They were passengers. Free women traveling under their own authority, with documents that established their legal status and resources that Waset had quietly arranged for their journey. They did not talk much during the journey. There was too much to process, too much that had happened, too much that they would need to decide about how to live in a world that did not know what they had survived. When they reached Thebes, they found a city that had changed in their absence. New buildings, new faces, new political arrangements that neither of them understood. The faction that had destroyed Nefertari's husband was gone, replaced by rivals who had no particular interest in her case. The bureaucracy that had sent her to Buhen had forgotten her entirely. Baki met them at the garrison where the convoy ended. He was older, more confident, dressed in the clothes of a mid-ranking official rather than the junior scribe she remembered. He greeted her with a formality that seemed strange after what they had shared, but she understood that this was necessary, that in Thebes he could not acknowledge openly what he had been to her in Buhen. "I have arranged housing for you," he said, "and a small stipend, enough to live on while you decide what to do next. It is the least I could do." "Why?" she asked. "You could have forgotten me. Everyone else did." "I am not everyone else. What I saw at Buhen, what I participated in, I have carried it with me for 3 years. Freeing you does not undo what was done to you, but it is something. It is what I could offer." He told her that Amenhotep, her husband, had died in the copper mines in the 2nd year of his sentence. He told her that Userhat, the man who had framed him, had fallen from power 2 years later, victim of the same factional politics he had used against others. He told her that Amenhotep's name had been cleared posthumously, his reputation restored, his work once again cited by scholars who had pretended to forget him. She listened to all of this with the numbness that had become her default state. Her husband was dead. Her enemy was destroyed. Her vindication had come, but it had come 7 years too late to matter. "What will you do now?" Baki asked. "I do not know. I have been surviving for so long that I have forgotten how to live. I will need to learn again." The years that followed were a different kind of struggle. Nefertari and Nofret remained together, sharing housing, sharing resources, sharing the burden of reintegrating into a society that sensed something different about them without understanding what it was. They were too old to marry easily. Nefertari was now 31, Nofret 24, and too marked by their experiences to fit comfortably into the roles that Egyptian society expected of women. They found work as scribes. This was unusual for women, nearly unprecedented, but they were literate and skilled and willing to work for wages that male scribes would have considered insulting. A few merchants, pragmatic about costs, were willing to employ them for correspondence, record-keeping, the endless documentation that commerce required. Nefertari discovered that she had a talent for the work. The years of counting, observing, cataloging in Buhin had trained her mind in ways that proved useful in civilian contexts. She remembered details that others forgot. She saw patterns that others missed. Her work was valued gradually by employers who cared more about results than about the strange silence that surrounded her past. She did not speak about Buhin, not to employers, not to casual acquaintances, not to anyone except Iset Nofre and, occasionally, Baki when he visited them. The experience remained inside her, a weight that she carried without acknowledgement, a story that she did not know how to tell. But she began slowly to write. Late at night, after the work was done and Iset Nofret had gone to sleep, she sat with papyrus and ink and tried to put into words what had happened to her. She wrote fragments at first moments, sensations, observations that came back to her unbidden. Then she wrote longer passages, attempting to construct a narrative from experiences that resisted narrative, that seemed designed to remain unspeakable. She wrote about the journey to Buhin, about the first week, about Hanut Mehit and Merit and the women who had not survived, about Senefer and the soldiers who were brutal and the soldiers who were merely indifferent, about Baki and Chaim Waset and the complicated forms that decency could take in a system designed to eliminate it. She wrote about what it felt like to be property, to exist in a category that Egyptian law had created, but that Egyptian language could not quite describe. She wrote about the dissolution, the threat of erasure, the strategies she had developed to remain herself when everything was trying to make her something else. She wrote about Iset Nofred, about the purpose that teaching and protecting had provided, about the way that caring for someone else had kept her connected to humanity when her own humanity seemed insufficient to anchor her. And she wrote about the return, about the strange disorientation of freedom, about the difference between legal status and social reality, about the question that she still could not fully answer: how to live in a world that did not know what she had survived. The writing was not meant for publication. There was no market for such stories, no audience that wanted to hear about the destruction of women in frontier garrisons. Egyptian literature celebrated heroic pharaohs and magical tales and wisdom that taught proper conduct. It did not confront the dark machinery of state punishment that consumed people like her. But she wrote anyway. She wrote because the story demanded to be told, even if only to herself. She wrote because putting words on papyrus made her experience real, gave it form, transformed it from something she had merely survived into something she could examine and understand. She wrote because she was not willing to let what had happened to her disappear, not willing to bury it and pretend it had not occurred, not willing to become what Egyptian society expected her to become, a silent woman with a strange past that no one discussed. 10 years after her release from Buhin, Nefertari made a decision. She was 41 years old. Iset Nofret had married a widower who had not cared about her past, had borne 2 children, had built a life that looked almost normal. They remained close, but their paths had diverged in ways that were probably inevitable. Baki had risen to a senior position in the temple administration, had married appropriately, had become a respectable man who rarely visited the district where Nefertari lived. She did not blame him. His patronage had saved her life. She could not expect him to sacrifice his career for a friendship that would only raise uncomfortable questions. She had continued writing. The fragments had become a manuscript, a full account of her 7 years at Buhin and her years of recovery afterward. It was not polished literature. It was testimony, raw and unsparing, the closest thing to truth she could produce. And she decided to make it public. Not publication in the traditional sense. She had no access to the channels through which literature circulated, no patrons who would sponsor a work so far outside conventional categories. But she had contacts among the scribal community, people she had worked with who respected her skills, even if they did not entirely understand her story. She began making copies. She distributed them to people who might be interested: scholars, administrators, the occasional foreign merchant who passed through Thebes and might carry her words to places Egypt's censorship did not reach. She did not expect the copies to survive. She did not expect her testimony to change anything, but she wanted it to exist, to be in the world, to provide evidence that might someday matter to someone. One copy went to the temple of Maat, the goddess of truth and justice. The priests did not know what to do with it. Such testimony did not fit any category they recognized, but they preserved it in their archives, where fragments would survive for centuries. One copy went to Baki, with a letter thanking him for everything he had done, and asking nothing in return except that he remember what he had witnessed. One copy went to Isetnofret, the only person still living who truly understood what the manuscript described, and one copy Nefertari kept for herself, hidden among her possessions, proof that she had existed, that she had survived, that she had told her story even if no one was listening. Nefertari lived to be 62 years old. In her final years, she achieved a modest prosperity that her younger self could not have imagined. Her scribal work had brought her clients who valued reliability over social conventions. She owned a small house, employed a servant, lived with a degree of comfort that approximated the life she had known before her sentence. Isetnofret visited regularly with her children, who called Nefertari aunt and did not know the history that connected them. The children brought life into her house, noise and chaos, and the uncomplicated joy of youth that she had never been able to experience for herself. She never married. She never had children. These possibilities had been taken from her by the years at Buhan, by the damage that continuous violation had done to her body, by the psychological barriers that made intimacy impossible to contemplate. She had made peace with its absence, or something like peace, the recognition that some losses could not be undone, only accepted and incorporated into whatever life remained. She thought often about the women who had not survived: Henutmehit, who had taught her how to endure; Sitmut, who had been destroyed by Senefer's cruelty; the new arrivals who had not learned fast enough, who had been consumed by the system before they could develop the strategies of survival. She remembered their names, their faces, the details of their stories that no one else would ever know. She was the keeper of their memory. That had become another purpose, another reason for the writing that continued until her eyes grew too weak to see the papyrus clearly. When she died, it was quietly, in her sleep, in the house she had earned through years of work and endurance. Isetnofret arranged the burial according to proper rites, ensuring that she would be remembered as a free woman, a scribe, a survivor. The tomb inscription said nothing about Buhan, nothing about the 7 years, nothing about what had been done to her, or how she had managed to continue existing afterward. But in the archives of the Temple of Maat, in the fragments that would survive for scholars to discover millennia later, her testimony remained. Her story existed. She had refused to be erased. What you have learned tonight is not the history that Egypt wanted remembered. The civilization that built the pyramids, that developed writing and medicine and astronomy, also developed methods of punishment designed to destroy people without killing them. The beautiful temples, the elaborate tombs, the art that celebrates the divine order of Ma'at, all of this coexisted with the garrison at Buhan and the women who were fed into its machinery. This is not unique to Egypt. Every civilization has maintained systems of cruelty that its official narratives prefer to ignore. Every society that celebrates its achievements has also created categories of person who could be used, discarded, erased from the record without acknowledgement or consequence. What makes Nefertari's story significant is not that Egypt was uniquely cruel, it is that she survived and left testimony that allows us to know what happened. Most women in her situation left no record at all. Their existence can only be inferred from administrative documents that describe punishments in clinical language, from archaeology that reveals the bones of people who died in places they should never have been. Nefertari wrote. Nefertari remembered. Nefertari refused the silence that her society expected, the burial of experience that would have made her disappearance complete. The fragments that survive are incomplete, damaged by time and circumstance. But they are enough to tell us that she existed, that she survived, that she found ways to remain human in conditions designed to eliminate humanity. And they remind us to ask questions about the systems we live in now. What cruelties do our own civilizations maintain? What categories of person do we allow to be used, discarded, erased? What testimonies are not being written because the people who could write them are too damaged, too silenced, too consumed by survival to find words for what they experience? Remember Nefertari. Remember the woman who was given to the soldiers of Buhin and survived to write about what happened to her. Remember that she was 24 years old when her life was destroyed, 31 when she was finally freed, 62 when she died in a house she had earned through work that society barely permitted her to do. Remember that she found purpose in teaching Iset Nofret, in preserving the memory of women who did not survive, in writing testimony that might matter to someone someday. Remember that survival is not passive. It is not merely continuing to exist. It is a series of decisions, strategies, purposes that must be found and maintained when everything is trying to make you disappear. Remember that some of the survivors of terrible things choose to bury their experiences, and that this choice deserves respect. But remember also that some choose to speak, and that their speech makes possible an understanding that silence cannot provide. Remember that the most disgusting punishment used in ancient Egypt was not execution, which ends quickly, or even slavery, which at least provides clear status. It was the dissolution of personhood, the reduction to communal property, the destruction of everything that makes someone a self while leaving their body intact to continue being used. Remember that Nefertari was not destroyed. She was damaged, permanently, in ways that shaped the rest of her life. But she was not destroyed. She remained herself inside when everything outside was trying to erase her. She survived. She wrote. She remembered. And now, through the fragments that she left behind, through the testimony that survived when so much else was lost, we remember too. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand ancient Egypt from the pyramids and the pharaohs and the golden treasures. Because Egypt was also Nefertari, given to the soldiers at Buhin, surviving 7 years of systematic destruction, returning to a world that did not know what she had endured. Egypt was also the women who did not survive, whose names are lost, whose bones lie in the desert sand. Egypt was also the system that created this punishment, refined it, applied it to women whose crimes were often merely being connected to men who had offended the powerful. Remember all of it. Remember the golden masks and the beautiful temples and the extraordinary achievements of ancient civilization. But remember also what that civilization did to those who fell outside its protections. Remember Nefertari. Remember